Welcome to Shoot for the Moon, the Space Race, Part 3, an interactive U.S. history tutorial for students like you. In the previous tutorial in this series, we ended with Apollo 10. That mission served as a complete staging, like a full dress rehearsal, of the Apollo 11 mission, without actually landing on the surface of the moon. In that mission, the LEM descended to about 47,000 feet above the surface of the moon, but didn't land. The LEM also made passes over the future Apollo 11 landing site. When everything went well with the Apollo 10 mission, NASA was a go for the lunar mission of Apollo 11. Apollo 11 was the first crewed mission to land on the moon, and really was one giant leap for mankind. The famous first steps taken by Neil Armstrong were the first human steps to be taken on another planetary body. On July 20th, 1969, it's estimated that 650 million people watched the televised image of Neil Armstrong and heard his voice as he took his famous first steps on the moon.
Yeah, I'm going to step off the LEM now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Let's step back and take a look at this memorable mission. Apollo 11 launched from Cape Kennedy on July 16, 1969, with astronauts Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin. All three were veterans of Project Gemini. With the launch of Apollo 11, Armstrong remarked, "This Saturn gave us a magnificent ride. It was beautiful." Once in lunar orbit, this CSM, piloted by Michael Collins, remained in orbit around the moon, while Armstrong and Aldrin descended to the moon in the LEM, which was nicknamed Eagle. After dodging a lunar crater and a boulder field just before touchdown, Armstrong landed the LEM in an area called the Sea of Tranquility.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
Armstrong emerged first from the LEM, and while descending, he released the modularized equipment stowage assembly, on which the surface television camera was stowed. That camera recorded humankind's first step on the moon. Armstrong collected a sample of lunar surface material to be returned to Earth in case their time on the lunar surface had to be ended early. Buzz Aldrin emerged from the LEM and climbed down to the lunar surface about 20 minutes after Armstrong. He became the second person to walk on the surface of the moon. Aboard the CSM traveling in lunar orbit, astronaut Michael Collins didn't get to witness the lunar module's landing, but he heard Armstrong's voice over the radio as he told Mission Control that the Eagle had landed.
Roger, we rigged you 5 by Columbia. He has landed, Tranquility Base. Eagle is at Tranquility, over.
Yeah, I heard the whole thing.
Well, good show.
Fantastic.
Collins would end up circling the moon, completely alone, for more than a day, as Armstrong and Aldrin worked on the moon's surface.
Beautiful view. Isn't that something? Magnificent sight out here. Magnificent desolation.
Aldrin and Armstrong conducted the first EVA, or extravehicular activity, on the lunar surface, which lasted roughly 2.5 hours. The astronauts carried out a series of activities during this moonwalk, which ranged 300 feet from the lunar module. They deployed a device to measure the composition of solar wind reaching the moon. They set up a special seismometer to measure moonquakes and meteor impacts. They collected rocks and soil samples, ultimately collecting over 50 pounds of lunar surface material to take back to Earth. The rock samples were later estimated to be about 3.7 billion years old. The astronauts took panoramic photographs of the region and close-up photographs of the lunar surface material, as well as photographs of each other and the LEM. They left behind mementos bearing the names of the 3 Apollo 1 astronauts who died in the fire and the 2 Soviet cosmonauts who also died in accidents during the space race. They left behind a plaque that was affixed to the ladder on the section of the LEM that would be used as a launch pad and would remain behind on the surface of the moon.
For those who haven't read the plaque, we'll read the plaque that's on the front landing gear of this LEM. There's two hemispheres, one showing each of the two hemispheres of Earth. Underneath it says, "Dear men from the planet Earth, first set foot upon the moon, July 1969, AD. We came in peace for all mankind." It has the crew members' signatures and the signature of the President of the United States.
The astronauts also left behind an American flag, whose pole was planted into the lunar surface. Roughly 21.5 hours after landing on the moon, Aldrin and Armstrong took off in the LEM and returned to the CSM flying in lunar orbit. The Apollo 11 crew made a successful return to Earth, with a splashdown in the Pacific Ocean on July 24, 1969. Apollo 11 achieved its primary mission, which was to perform a human-piloted lunar landing and return safely to Earth. It also achieved President Kennedy's goal to land a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s. With this mission, the U.S. also succeeded in beating the Soviets to the moon. After Apollo 11's successful moon landing mission, Project Apollo continued. In November 1969, 4 months after Apollo 11's mission to the moon, NASA launched its second crewed mission to land on the moon. Apollo 12's crew consisted of astronauts Pete Conrad, Dick Gordon, and Alan Bean. Conrad and Gordon were veterans of Project Gemini. Within the first half-minute of Apollo 12's launch, the Saturn V launch vehicle was struck twice by lightning.
I think we need to do a little more all-weather testing. Amen.
But the launch successfully continued.
Hey, that's one of the better sims, believe me. We've had a couple of cardiac arrests down here too, Pete. There wasn't any time for that up here.
The goals of this mission included more detailed exploration of the lunar surface, taking photographs of possible lunar landing sites for future missions, and developing the astronauts' capabilities of working in the lunar environment. Conrad and Bean descended to the moon's surface in the LEM, nicknamed Intrepid, and landed on target in an area called the Ocean of Storms. NASA selected this landing site because it was close to where an unmanned spacecraft, called the Surveyor 3, had landed on the moon just over 2 years prior to Apollo 12's mission.
Down to the pad. Man, that may have been a small one for Neil, but that's a long one for me. I'm going to step off the pad, Mark. Ooh, is that frosting? Hey, that's me.
During their EVAs on the moon, Bean and Conrad collected parts and materials from the Surveyor 3, including a television camera, to take back to Earth. Scientists wanted to study how these objects had been affected by long-term exposure to the elements on the lunar surface. During their EVAs on the moon, the astronauts also conducted a 5,200-foot traverse of the area to collect rock and soil samples. They also deployed the Apollo Lunar Surface Experiments Package, or ALSEP, which would remain on the moon to gather seismic, scientific, and engineering data. After almost 32 hours on the moon, the Intrepid successfully rejoined the CSM in orbit, and the crew returned safely to Earth. Apollo 13 launched on April 11, 1970, with astronauts Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes. Lovell was a veteran of Project Gemini and had also flown on Apollo 8. The first 2 days of Apollo 13's flight were mostly uneventful. The capsule communicator at Mission Control, Joe Kerwin, told the Apollo 13 crew, "The spacecraft is in real good shape as far as we are concerned. We're bored to tears down here." This boredom didn't last much longer.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem.
About 56 hours into the flight, when Apollo 13 was roughly 200,000 miles from Earth, the crew heard a bang as warning lights went off in the command module. The warning lights indicated that one oxygen tank had failed, the second oxygen tank was failing, and 2 of the 3 fuel cells were at 0. The fuel cells generated electrical power, drinking water, and oxygen for breathing. Roughly 13 minutes after the explosion, Lovell looked out of the command module's window and saw that the spacecraft was venting something into space.
O2 quantity number 2 is 0.
That's AC, okay. Yeah, that's because of AC. And it looks to me, looking out the hatch, that we are venting something. We are venting something out into space.
Roger, we copy your venting.
It's a gas of some sort.
It was oxygen gas escaping from the remaining oxygen tank. Lovell recalls, when the explosion first occurred, we didn't know what had happened. It wasn't until I saw the oxygen escaping and saw on the instrument panel that we completely lost oxygen out of one tank and it was rapidly disappearing out of the second that I realized we were in deep trouble. An hour or so after the explosion, everyone came to the conclusion that Apollo 13's mission had to change. A member of Mission Control recalls, "We finally got to the point where we realized we weren't going to land on the moon. The mission was gone. The mission became to get the astronauts home alive. Mission Control made the decision to have the crew transfer from the command module to the LEM, nicknamed Aquarius, and use it as a lifeboat to transport the astronauts back to Earth. The LEM had its own oxygen, water, and power supplies, as well as a propulsion system. Riding in the LEM, while still connected to the command and service module, the astronauts would circle the moon without landing and return to Earth. Meanwhile, the command module was powered down to save as much power as possible for re-entry. The command module was the only part of the spacecraft that was designed to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. Without it, the crew wouldn't be able to land. The LEM was designed to support 2 men for 2 days on the lunar surface. It was now being used to support 3 men for about 4 days as the crew returned to Earth. A buildup of carbon dioxide inside the LEM quickly became a concern. It had to be removed from the craft. However, the square canisters that removed carbon dioxide from the command module wouldn't fit on the round openings in the LEM's environmental system. After experimenting back on Earth, the team on the ground devised a way for the astronauts to create a makeshift adapter that would allow the square carbon dioxide scrubbers from the CM to fit into the round scrubber holes on the LEM. You might say that they devised a way to put a square peg into a round hole. The makeshift adapter consisted of items the astronauts had on hand, things like canisters, tape, plastic bags, cardboard, and suit hoses. Lovell recalls, the contraption wasn't very handsome, but it worked. The rest of the flight back to Earth was a very unpleasant one for the crew. All non-critical systems in the LEM were turned off to conserve power. Temperature inside the LEM fell to around 38 degrees, and it was almost impossible for the astronauts to sleep because of the cold. Some of their food became inedible. They also had to conserve water, drinking around 6 ounces a day, and struggled with dehydration. The crew lost a total of 31 pounds during the flight. Hayes was also sick and in pain for much of the trip. Back on Earth, Mission Control worked on developing a new procedure for powering up the command module. Something like this would normally take several months of work, but they did it in 3 days. About 4 hours before Apollo 13 would attempt to land, the service module, which was where the damaged oxygen tanks were located, was jettisoned. The crew got their first look at the damaged craft.
Copy that. And there's one whole side of that spacecraft missing. Is that right? Right by the, look out there, will you? Right by the high gate antenna, the whole panel is blown out, almost from the base to the engine. Copy that. Yeah, it looks like it got to the SPS cell too, yes sir. I could think the SPS engine bell, huh? Wait, look, that's just dark brown streak. It's really a mess.
The crew then transferred back into the command module and used Mission Control's new procedure to power it up. The LEM, which had been their lifeboat, was jettisoned about an hour before re-entry. The crew then made a safe and successful splashdown on April 17, 1970. The mission has been called a successful failure because the crew never landed on the moon, but they did make it back home safely. Looking back, Lovell believes the Apollo 13 mission remains one of NASA's finest hours. In retrospect, after years of thinking about it, the explosion of Apollo 13 was probably the best thing that could have happened to the space program. Apollo 14 was launched in January 1971, with astronauts Stu Rossi, Alan Shepard, and Ed Mitchell. If you remember, Shepard was a part of Project Mercury and was the first American in space. After his first mission, Shepard was grounded, meaning he had to stop flying for nearly a decade due to an ear problem. On Apollo 14, Shepard was finally able to return to space. During their flight to the moon, the crew experienced some difficulties with docking, and it took 6 tries before they were able to dock the CSM with the LEM. Shepard and Rossi took the LEM to the moon and landed in an area called From Morrow. This was the intended landing site of the aborted Apollo 13 mission.
Okay, Al, beautiful. We can see you coming down the ladder right now. It looks like you're about on the bottom step and on the surface. Bedford, old man. Okay, you're right. Al is on the surface, and it's been a long way, but we're here.
Shepard and Rossi conducted 2 EVAs on the lunar surface. The astronauts used a modularized equipment transporter, or MET, which was basically a specialized handcart, to haul equipment during their EVAs. They performed investigations of the area, set up more scientific equipment, and collected samples, like rocks and soil, that would be studied by science teams in the U.S., as well as 14 other countries. Shepard also set a new distance traveled record on the lunar surface of about 9,000 feet. Before concluding his last EVA, while broadcasting back to Earth, Shepard took out a golf club and hit 2 golf balls while on the surface of the moon, much to the delight of the audience back home.
They got more dirt than ball that side. The more dirt than ball. Here we go again. That looked like a slice to me, Al. Here we go. Three the die. One more. Miles and miles and miles.
Apollo 15 launched in July 1971, with astronauts Dave Scott, Al Worden, and Jim Irwin. Dave Scott was a veteran of the Gemini 8 and Apollo 9 missions. Apollo 15 was the first of the Apollo J missions, which were capable of staying longer on the moon. The LEM landed in an area on the lunar surface called Hadley Rill. Scott and Irwin spent almost 18.5 hours conducting a total of 3 EVAs on the lunar surface, a new record. The crew also took the first lunar roving vehicle, also called a lunar rover, to the moon. The lunar rover allowed the astronauts to traverse roughly 17 miles during their explorations, which far exceeded what the Apollo 11, 12, and 14 astronauts were collectively able to complete on foot.
Man, this is really a rock and rollin' ride, isn't it? Never been on a ride like this before. Boy, oh boy. I'm glad they got this great suspension system on this thing. Boy.
During their EVAs on the lunar surface, the astronauts took more photographs, set up more scientific equipment, and collected more samples.
Oh man, look at that. Look at the glint. Almost see twinning in there. Guess what we just found? Guess what we just found? I think we found what we came for. Crystal and rock, huh? Yes, sir. You better believe it.
Yes, sir.
Pledge in there. Almost all pledge. She likes it. As a matter of fact, Oh boy, I think we might have ourselves something close to the north side. Because it's crystalline and there's just a bunch of just almost all plants. What a beaut. That is really a beauty, and there's another one down there. Yeah, we'll get some of these. Back it up.
They also evaluated modifications to the LEM that allowed it to stay roughly 3 days on the moon, and modifications that allowed it to carry more cargo, or a heavier payload. After the LEM returned to lunar orbit and docked with the CSM, the crew launched a sub-satellite, which was the first time this had been done from a crewed spacecraft in lunar orbit. 2 days later, Worden took a record-setting spacewalk by becoming the first person to carry out a deep space EVA. Apollo 15 also set records for the longest time in lunar orbit, about 145 hours, the longest crewed lunar mission, 295 hours, and the longest Apollo mission, 295 hours. Apollo 16 launched in April 1972 with Ken Mattingly, John Young, and Charlie Duke. Young was a veteran of the Gemini 3, Gemini 10, and Apollo 10 missions. On Apollo 16's mission, the LEM, nicknamed Orion, landed in the Descartes region of the moon. Upon landing on the lunar surface, astronauts Young and Duke deployed the lunar rover, the second rover to be taken to the moon. They spent roughly 20 hours conducting 3 EVAs and drove about 16 miles in the lunar rover. They spent time surveying the area, taking photographs, and collecting samples.
Boy, is this fun.
They conducted geological exploration at sites like Plum Crater, Flag Crater, Spook Crater, Cinco Crater, and North Ray Crater. The astronauts also deployed the first moon-based telescope, a far ultraviolet camera spectrograph, that could take pictures and spectra of astronomical objects in ultraviolet light, a type of radiation invisible to human eyes. They used the telescope to study star clusters, nebulae, and the Large Magellanic Cloud, a small galaxy orbiting the Milky Way. They also used the telescope to look back at Earth and study its upper atmosphere. The final Apollo mission, Apollo 17, launched on December 7, 1972. It was the first crewed launch conducted in darkness. Its crew consisted of astronauts Jack Schmitt, Ron Evans, and Gene Cernan. Cernan was a veteran of the Gemini 9 and Apollo 10 missions. With this mission, Jack Schmitt became the first scientist astronaut to set foot on the moon. Schmitt was a trained geologist and had earned a PhD in geology from Harvard University before undergoing astronaut training. Cernan and Schmitt took the LEM, nicknamed Challenger, to the moon and landed in the Taurus-Littrow Highlands area, a site that was selected for its geologic variety.
In Houston, I step off at the surface at Taurus-Littrow. We'd like to dedicate the first steps of Apollo 17 to all those who made it possible. I came out here. Oh my golly. Unbelievable.
Cernan and Schmitt conducted 3 EVAs on the surface, creating a new total record of just over 22 hours. The second EVA alone lasted just over 7.5 hours, which was the longest moonwalk of the Apollo program.
I was strolling on the moon one day in a merry, merry month of December. No, May.
Aided by the third lunar rover taken to the moon, they conducted a great deal of geologic surveying and sampling of the area. They traversed the greatest distance in the lunar rover and also retrieved the greatest amount of rock and soil samples, roughly 243 pounds of material. Knowing this would be the last Apollo mission, and likely the last crewed moon landing for many years to come, the crew marked the milestone by leaving a plaque on the moon that said, "Here, man completed his first explorations of the moon, December 1972 AD. May the spirit of peace in which we came be reflected in the lives of all mankind." astronaut Gene Cernan became the last Apollo astronaut to walk on the moon. He relayed back to Earth, "As I take man's last steps from the surface, back home, for some time to come, but we believe not too long into the future. I'd like to just list what I believe history will record, that America's challenge of today has forged man's destiny of tomorrow. And, as we leave the moon at Tars Litro, we leave as we come, and God willing, as we shall return, with peace and hope for all mankind. Godspeed the crew of Apollo 17. Cernan remains the last person to set foot on the moon. There have been no crewed lunar missions by any space program in any country since Project Apollo. With the final mission of Project Apollo, the astronauts completed the longest stay on the moon at roughly 75 hours. Astronaut Ron Evans also completed the last Apollo spacewalk in deep space with this mission. The lunar missions of Project Apollo are also still the only crewed missions to have left low Earth orbit. The crew returned home safely to Earth with a splashdown on December 19, 1972. With the conclusion of Project Apollo, 6 crewed missions to the moon, Apollo 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17, allowed 12 astronauts to walk on the lunar surface. These 12 men are still the only people to have ever walked on the surface of the moon.